So I just wanted to say, so the media lens can be bad, but not always, because they need to see the positive change as well.
Right.
Absolutely.
And go right ahead.
Yeah, because I think education is the key. Through education we gain knowledge, and the more knowledge we have of one another, I think the more tolerant we'll be. And the issue now is not just race. Race is very important, but I think we have an overlapping of major issues. One is culture. You have people discriminating on the basis of cultural differences. You have social class also, even in the African American population and in some of the other minority population. Social class has become an not even more important issue, but just as important as race. So you have all of these things going on that overlapping. In a society as a whole, you have different hierarchies, but in the individual communities, African American, Hispanic community, you also have hierarchies, whether it's based on race, the tone of the skin color, or whether it's based on the social class status. You have all these things going on. So some people have to deal with a multiplicity of issues. But like I've said earlier, education is the key. One of the things I find that my students are so shocked when I tell them, when we go back into the history, especially with respect to African Americans, that we try to establish a timeline about when major things happened that should have brought us to where we are right now. Because some of the students will say, well, African Americans shouldn't complain. They should be educated by now like everybody else. They should have everything like everybody else. So I tell them, look at 1860s when the emancipation occurred, and look at the 1960s when we had the civil rights movement. That's a whole century when nothing really happened that was positive to improve the whole community, when basically it was just uphill battle. You had Jim Crow, and you had lynching, and you had the Brown, desegregation segregation and all these other things that were going on that actually posed stumbling blocks to development. So if we talk about freedom, we're talking about 40-something years ago, not 140-something years.
I think, too, just to jump in, I think there's an issue in the kind of complexity that Christiana was talking about. There are categories that were not previously thought of as racialized, which often become racialized. For example, speaking a language, speaking Spanish. Sometimes, 50 years ago, people who spoke Spanish were classified as white under the law, legally. And then there were a series of court decisions that changed that, because it was discovered that especially in the Southwest, people who were Mexican American were subject to all kinds of school segregation and public segregation. Then we have issues that involve people who are Middle Eastern, and whether or not that's an ethnic form of discrimination. There are people because of their sexual preferences, we mentioned previously. So there are groups that are being classified as the other, those people. And so this is why this issue of diversity and race and discrimination is such a critical factor. And I think one possible positive thing is that we are not alone in this world. And I think that the way we deal with it in this country is a lot better than a lot of other societies deal with it. I mean, we have a democratic society with all of its weaknesses and all of its obvious flaws, but we have a society where we bring the stuff in the open and we talk about it like we're doing now.
And there's another thing that I want to add to that, to both what Alonzo and Christiana said, is the factor of mobility. Within the last 50 years, we've become much more of a mobile society in the sense that people move faster. They move greater distances from where their origins are. And so then because when people do that, when people become nomadic, if you will, in that regards, then of course whatever issues that were seemingly once only prevalent in the small community in which I once resided, I get to see those issues transferred to another area. And just because I knew how to deal with it in the community in which I resided at one time, moving to that other community, because the rules of engagement change. When you change the community, the rules of engagement change. And so then the way that people respond also changes. And sometimes that also can serve as a positive, as Alonzo was saying, because sometimes what happens when people move is I've had some experiences that you didn't know were prevalent or were existing in another part of the country, and so that I can tell you what's going on there because I've just left that area.
And you're talking about another part of the country and experiences people bring. And Christiana, we talked a little bit about this before. Montgomery College classrooms, I want to bring it back for a minute, are really a microcosm of the world, people like to say.
Absolutely.
We've got people from all over the world in the classrooms who come not only from different parts of the country, but different parts of the world. I wonder if we could hear from each of you sort of briefly on some of those classroom experiences, times in which you could say you learned from something, a dynamic you saw in the classroom from the students, because there's learning that goes on in that order to you.
Absolutely. The textbook that I mentioned earlier, Issues of Gender, the very first semester that I taught that text was a summer session, and which is generally when I would try out a new textbook, is in the summer time before I use it in the fall. And in this particular instance, there was an Ethiopian student and an Eritrean student in the class. And those two countries being at war with each other, or those two segments of what some people consider the same country being at war, depending on how one views that part of the world. Initially, I did not know that the two students were Ethiopian and Eritrean until after we'd formed the groups. And one of the concerns that immediately came to my mind was, okay, did I do something wrong here by putting these two students in the group together? And is that going to cause a degree of tension that's going to become dysfunctional in the group? Well, ultimately what happened is my worries turned out to be for naught, because those two students seemed to work better together than some of the other students in other groups who were not from seemingly opposing factions. And so then kind of gave me a lesson in how to construct groups as well. But it also gave the rest of the class a lesson in how opposing factions can come together and still work together.
Wow. We only have just a little bit of time. Did either of you want to add in any quick experiences that you've had?
And we should say we got about 30 seconds. Sorry, I have to do that to you.
Yeah, I can just say quickly that because of the nature of what I teach, sociology, we talk about a lot of things, and one is race relations and ethnic groups. And in the last few weeks, when we discussed ethnic groups, I actually asked the class whether we had any Japanese in the classroom. And the class said no. And I said, do we have any Chinese in the class? Vietnamese, they said no. I said, do we have any Chinese? They said, yes, 5. And I said, can you tell me who's Chinese, who's African, who's, and all the students participated in that. They like that. But all the Asians in the class, they call them Chinese. And it turned out to be Vietnamese and other categories.
Well, we want to thank all of you for being on the show today and for bringing this important issue to students at Montgomery College and to our community and talking about issues of discrimination today. And thanks so much to all of you. And thanks to you for watching Campus Conversations. I'm Steve Simon.
And I'm Fritzi Bodenheimer. If you have comments about today's show or suggestions for future episodes, send an email to campus.conversations@montgomerycollege.edu. For all of us here at Campus Conversations, thanks for watching.